Good evening, everyone. My name is Deborah Harsma, and I am president of BioLogos. Welcome to our event today, How Christians Can Help End the Pandemic, with leading biologist Dr. Francis Collins and leading pastor and author Dr. David Anderson. At BioLogos, we believe that faith and science don't have to be at war, that biblical Christ-centered faith can work hand in hand with science and medicine to address the deepest needs of our world. At our website, biologos.org, you can find information on many science and faith topics, including what we'll be addressing tonight. The pandemic has been hard and long. We're mourning over 500,000 deaths, plus the impact on jobs, schooling, mental health. Sometimes we wonder if it has all been worth it. But there are hopeful signs that the end is in sight. The next couple of months will be crucial. The vaccines are arriving, but so are new virus variants and new questions. And there are ongoing concerns as many people of color do not have equal access to health care. Many people are making decisions right now on vaccination for themselves and their families and wading through a lot of crazy things on social media from people with MDs and PhDs behind their names saying false information. And people have real questions about vaccines. We hope to address those tonight. Although things are hard and uncertain, as Christians, we do not live in fear. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 4, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned, because we know the one who raised Christ Jesus from the dead. So we just celebrated Easter. We celebrate the victory of Christ over death and sin and fear. We have two great speakers with us this evening. Dr. David Anderson is founder and senior pastor of Bridgeway Community Church, a multicultural congregation of over 10,000 at 2 sites in Maryland with viewers from around the world. His radio talk show is heard every afternoon on WAVA, the largest Christian talk station on the East Coast. And he is the author of Gracism, The Art of Inclusion. He's a leader in building bridges across deep divides of faith, race, culture, and wealth. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Hey, thank you. So good to see you.
Good to see you too. And we have with us Dr. Francis Collins, who's a physician and a geneticist. He led the International Human Genome Project, and he's served under 3 different presidents as director of the National Institutes of Health. During the pandemic, he has been shepherding our country's research on COVID treatments and vaccines. He told his testimony of coming to faith in his 2006 book, The Language of God, and founded BioLogos in 2009. And last year, he won the Templeton Prize in Science and Religion. Great to have you with us again, Dr. Collins.
Oh, thank you, Deb. It's a pleasure to be here with Dr. Anderson and to talk about these very important issues. So thank you for arranging this.
Indeed. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Dr. Anderson, let's start with you just a little bit. You've had me on your radio show a few times to talk about astronomy, to talk about vaccines. Are you a bit of a science fan, or why is it important to talk about science and medicine as a Christian leader?
Well, thanks, Deb. I would consider myself a bridge builder. And so if I can build bridges between different groups of people, that brings me great joy. And being a bridge builder between faith and science is so important because they really don't have to be at odds with one another. And so I think that having you on the show and having these kind of conversations will help people who weren't brought up with a lot of science to realize that they're not disowning their faith just because they're learning facts about science. And then it helps on the scientific side to know you don't have to be afraid of people of faith. They're not boogeymen who don't have a mind. So like you, like Dr. Collins, I'm a bridge builder.
Oh, that's so important, that bridge building. We've worked to do that at BioLogos, and it's been so great to partner with you and the incredible gift that you have for bridge building. Dr. Collins, talk a little bit about how that bridge looks in your own life. You're a scientist, but for people listening who haven't met you before, can you talk a little about your faith and how your faith intersects with your scientific work?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Yes, I am a scientist and a physician. I've had this wonderful privilege of leading efforts like the Genome Project and now the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, the National Institutes of Health. But I'm a follower of Jesus people think that that might be somehow a difficult thing to put together, and that you might encounter experiences where your head exploded because you couldn't put these worldviews into the same issues. I have not found that to be the case at all. Now, I didn't grow up in a faith tradition. My parents weren't really interested in those things, and I was an atheist by the time I was a graduate student. And then as a medical student encountering experiences of life and death, I realized I had some work to do to figure out, why do people believe? And why does science not really help me with questions like, why am I here? And is there a God? And what happened before there was something? And why is there something instead of nothing? And all of those questions that I decided were pretty interesting and which couldn't be addressed with a purely naturalistic perspective. And so, somewhat kicking and screaming over a 2-year effort of trying to understand the nature of belief, and led in many ways by someone who had traveled that path before me, namely C.S. Lewis, I ended up becoming a Christian, to my great surprise, at age 27. And yet, over the last 44 years, I have yet to encounter a circumstance where what I believe as a very serious Christian who tries to read the Bible every morning, and what I know as a scientist who won't accept your data about nature unless you have really defended it, I've never seen those to be in conflict. And COVID-19 certainly presents us with an experience where both of those have a lot to offer. Yes, we do have, as people of faith, a great deal of work to do here to understand the pain and the suffering, and to go through what appropriately would be called a time of lament. But we also have the opportunity to build upon the strengths that science is able to give us, that God has given us the grace to be able to understand, and to bring those tools forward to try to help those who are suffering, and try to heal this disease and heal our land and heal our planet from what has been the worst outbreak of infectious disease in 103 years.
Yeah, it's so true. We need both. We need both the scientific information and the Christian faith. The science alone is not enough. I've been a little frustrated how often people just say, trust science, as if that is the last or only word in this matter, when there's so many more factors that we need to think of. And science isn't what gives us hope. It's Jesus Christ who gives us hope.
Amen.
Amen to that. So we have a ton of questions here on the list, so we probably should get to it. We're going to start with some of the medical and science issues, and then we'll broaden out to these larger questions. But Faith will be with us all of the way here. So, Dr. Collins, I've heard some people saying they don't plan to get vaccinated because God designed the body to heal itself. But with a vaccine, the body is doing something, right? So can you tell us, how do vaccines work, and how did God design our bodies to make use of them?
Well, first, let me say I understand that perspective. And one of the things I've learned over the course of the last year is when people are concerned about vaccines and whether that's something that would be good for them and their family and their community, the first thing I need to do is listen and understand what those concerns are about, because they're different from person to person. This argument that, in fact, God has designed the human body in an amazing way is absolutely true. And it's something that I marvel at every day as a physician and a scientist. But I also know that the body is under attack sometimes from outside influences, and this virus is one of those. For people who are able to see the actual video cast, I'm holding up a model of this coronavirus, which got somehow into our species, presumably from a bat, where we maybe should have stayed but didn't. And so it's this spherical object with these spiky proteins on the surface of it. And those spiky proteins are the way in which the virus manages to get inside your cells, because it has sort of a lock and key ability to find a cell in your airway and then get inside and start copying itself. The way the vaccine works is to utilize what we've learned about this virus to generate antibodies just against that spike protein. So the vaccines provide you with the opportunity to become immune to those spike proteins without having to be exposed to the whole virus. This is really important. None of the vaccines include the intact virus, because that might be a risk of actually giving you the disease. None of them do that. They only allow your immune system to see that spike protein and to be primed to be ready, if it ever comes along later in the form of that virus, to be able to go after it. So the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine or the J&J vaccine, they all use that same principle. And it's an elegant way to take the incredible intricacy of our immune system, which if you study it, you can't help but be in awe of what God has made possible here, and prime it to be ready to face off against something terrible, just like we have been doing down through the centuries with smallpox, with polio. People who are listening to this around as I was in the 1950s when polio was paralyzing lots of kids, they were praying every day for a vaccine to come forward, and finally it did. And look, now there's a few cases of polio still in the world, and we need to wipe them out. But that has just not been a concern of parents in the United States recently. It's that same approach. And for me as a believer, who's also a scientist, this seems like a gift from God. This is God's grace that has given us the ability to understand how this works and to be able to design an approach. And it feels like God is giving us a chance to be his healers. That God has provided that as an opportunity. And when you consider how much time Jesus spent and what we know about the short time of his life that's written about in the New Testament, and a lot of that time was healing. And I think we were supposed to notice that. And he charged the apostles to do healings as well. I think we've all kind of been called when we have the chance to heal those who are sick and prevent terrible illness and death. And that's where we are right now.
A Jesus healing ministry. We can all be part of continuing that. That's wonderful. Dr. Anderson, what would you like to hear Dr. Collins address on COVID and vaccines? You're hearing a lot of things in your community. Where should we go next?
Well, people have questions that are very practical on a ground level. And the science is amazing, but then you also have the everyday person who's like, okay, you tell me it's fine. But even if I believe it's fine, what does it mean if I'm pregnant or if I'm breastfeeding? Like we did vaccinations at my church on Wednesday, and the husband came and got vaccinated. I'd say, how's your wife doing? His response was, well, she's breastfeeding, and she just wasn't sure if she should get the vaccine or not. So at that point, it was more like a practical, should I or shouldn't I? So let me ask you, Dr. Collins, if a woman's pregnant, if a woman's breastfeeding, should I tell her to come next Wednesday when we're doing vaccinations as her pastor? Or should I say, hang on, wait, we're not quite sure?
All the evidence is that these vaccines are safe for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which is the official organization of the most sophisticated doctors who take care of pregnant women, is making it very clear they think women who are pregnant should take advantage of the vaccine. We've now had tens of thousands of pregnant women who have been immunized already. Some of them now have already delivered babies, and there has been no signal of any sort that there's an issue here. And likewise, we do not think breastfeeding is a risk at all. It may be that if the woman has been immunized and now has antibodies to protect themselves against COVID-19, that some of those will pass to the baby breastfeeding, and so the baby will also be protected. And that's a positive thing. There's a website I'd like to tell people about, which has recently been put up. The best website, frankly, to go to is the CDC, but it's a complicated place, and people who are a little skeptical about the government maybe don't think that's the place that they want to look. Go and look at a website called getvaccinesanswers.org. That's getvaccinesanswers, all one word with no spaces, .org. And you'll see some videos and some straightforward, simple answers to the questions that a lot of people ask. And I totally respect what the people in your church are doing. And Dr. Anderson, let me say, I think it's fantastic that your church has stepped up here to not only talk about the value of vaccines, but actually make it possible for people to come there and have the opportunity to get immunized in case it was difficult for them to find the right place. Because it's been a little hard for people to figure out, how do I get lined up for this? And for you to do that, and for a lot of other churches I'm hearing about to step up to this, I just think that is a wonderful way for the church to get engaged in trying to get us through this and to do that healing effort, which I think we're all called to do. Good for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really cool to see this pop up in our parking lot. People drive through, they get the shot in the arm while they're in the car. They wait for 15 minutes, and then our prayer team goes up to them and says, "How was it? And is there any way I can pray for you?" 90% of the people were like, "Thank you so much. No one's even ever asked me that." So they drive away, hopefully physically touched as well as spiritually touched.
That's just wonderful. Yeah. Pastor, let me ask you, because I do get this question, and I'm probably not in as good a position as you are. When you have somebody in your church or somebody you encounter on the street who says, isn't it sort of like not trusting God completely if I decide to get that vaccine? I mean, if God wanted me to get through this without getting sick, wouldn't that be enough? How do you answer that when somebody puts the question in those terms?
I'm going to put some dirt and mud and water, and then I'm going to give it to you in a glass. Does that take faith? Drink it. You see, there's a difference between faith and wisdom, right? And so you can trust God and drink the dirty water and hope that you don't get sick. But wisdom says, you know what? Clean water is better than dirty water. And it's the same with regard to the vaccine. Having faith in not taking the vaccine or having faith in taking the vaccine, they're both faith. But the question is not about faith. The question is about wisdom, right? And so there's no scripture that says, make sure you purify water before you drink it. But because we have wisdom, we say, you know what? Drinking contaminated water is not good for people, regardless of where they live on the earth. So let's get clean drinking water for all people and do whatever it takes in order to help them not get sick.
That's really helpful. I like that a lot. I've used the case, well, do you put on your seatbelt when you get in the car? And most people will say, yeah, I do. Well, does that mean you don't trust God to keep you out of an accident? Well, no, it's just a good thing to do. Well, okay. Now I think we're in a place with vaccines.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, too, is we're going to have some people who are vaccinated and some people who are not, right? And so I was at a family function with 10 people over Easter, and 2 of the young people in their 20s had not been vaccinated, but my mother, sister, and everybody else had been. And so the question is, how do we relate to them? So we kept masks on, but I think that that's going to be an ongoing thing where we're going to have these mixed groups. Any thought, Dr. Collins, on how do you relate to people who are not or will not be vaccinated, along with the people who are vaccinated?
That's a great question. I mean, first, let me say that the opportunities now to be able to gather together with people who are all vaccinated and to take your masks off and break bread together is such a relief. I have to tell you, my first experience with this was just yesterday, because Diane, my wife, and I have been so careful, and she just got through her immunization, 2 doses in her 2 weeks. And we invited a friend who I hadn't seen in quite a few months to come to our house for breakfast, a wonderful man of God. And it was interesting. He's also fully immunized. He walks in the door, and we're both a little bit like, and he's still got his mask on. And then he sort of realizes, I can take this off. And then he sort of sticks out his elbow for me to bump his elbow, because that's what we would have done before. And I said, oh, come on, Jerome. And so we had the biggest bear hug, and it was the most wonderfully happy moment of joy and celebration that, this is starting to get better. But if all of us hadn't been immunized, I would not have been able to do that. And for right now, to answer your question, because we still don't know for sure whether those who have been vaccinated might still be able to carry the virus even without symptoms. That means if you're in this company where there are other people who are not vaccinated, they potentially then could be infected, and they could spread it, and this could go on and on. And so our best hope for this is to get to the point where we have more and more gatherings where everybody's immunized. Then we can take off our masks and begin to have experiences that we all long for, which have been far too long coming back.
And we long for that day so much. That day is closer than it would have been without the incredible work you've done, Dr. Collins, on developing the vaccine so quickly. Now,
Yes.
I have some idea of like the inside of that, of how so many researchers just dropped everything to work on it. But it's very concerning to a lot of people. I heard somebody say, well, anytime somebody gives me something fast and free, I worry a little bit, you know. So tell us how we can have confidence in these vaccines despite the rapid development.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think a lot of people wonder about this, especially because of the name that was given to this project about a year ago, calling it Operation Warp Speed. I mean, it was supposed to convey that this is an emergent situation, and we should not waste a single day in getting these vaccines tested and, if possible, approved. But it did kind of convey the idea that maybe we're going to be cutting corners. Let me tell you, as the director of the National Institutes of Health, I was absolutely, and still am, deeply engaged in this hour by hour. And there were no corners cut at all in terms of the safety and the efficacy of these vaccines. What we were able to do was to cut out a lot of the bureaucracy, a lot of the downtimes in between the various phases of developing and testing a vaccine, which normally causes it to stretch out over 4 or 5 years. And because we didn't have that time, we were not happy with doing Operation Slow Boat. We really wanted to move this at the maximum it ever has been, and succeeded in doing so. But if people are worried about whether we ended up with vaccines that really should be considered safe, the data is all out there. And that's another thing we did. We made this the most transparent evaluation of these vaccines that's ever happened. All of the data from trials of at least 30,000 people were assessed in open public meetings with all the information there for everybody to look at and debate. And only after that did the FDA make a decision about whether these were safe and effective. And those began to be distributed then in December. I can't tell you enough just how amazing this was, that this got done in 11 months. And I cannot say enough about the scientists who really dropped everything, worked 24/7 to make this happen, not worrying about who was going to get the credit or whether anybody's going to make any money. Let's just try to figure out how we're going to save lives. And it turned out better than most of us dared to hope. I guess back about August or September, somebody would ask me, well, what would be a good enough vaccine for you to feel like, okay, this is going to be a good step forward? And I would say, you know, if we got 60% effective, that would still be about as good as a flu vaccine. And I would take that. And we got 95%. When the data was all there, I got to tell you, that was an emotional moment. I lost quite a few tears when this emerged. This is such an answer to prayer, that we not only have something that's going to help, it's really good and it's really safe. And I hope people have heard that. There's so much noise out there, especially in social media, and much of it from people who have an agenda of another sort. But look at the evidence and you will see this is an incredible gift. But you got to unwrap the gift if it's going to help you and your family and your community. The way you unwrap the gift is you roll up your sleeve. And we still have a ways to go. We're not done.
Dr. Collins, let me restate just to make sure people heard what you said. And that is this. You're saying that with this vaccine, there were no corners cut when it comes to the scientific development of it. The only thing that was cut was bureaucracy. That's what helped us to get it so quickly. Would you also say that there was work being done on this for many years prior to this time?
Yeah, thank you for that, because I do think that's really important. Particularly this new vaccine that's based on something called mRNA. People think maybe that was just invented in January of 2020 because, oh my gosh, here comes a new pandemic to do something. The technology for that has been under development for 25 years, bit by painful bit, figuring out how to make this work, eventually showing it worked in animals, building then a vaccine against a different virus, the MERS virus, which caused some pretty terrible sickness in the Middle East, which fortunately didn't come to the US. And then here comes the COVID-19 virus, which is part of that same family. And it's like, we know what to do, but it's because of 25 years of work we know what to do. And that vaccine was defined, developed was designed in the space of about 48 hours because of all that fundamental information, which was a great place to be. That's really important. People think that maybe science just sort of happens all of a sudden. Almost nothing I've ever been involved in happened all of a sudden. It's built over years and years, standing on the shoulders of previous scientists who have made discoveries and then get to the next level.
So, Dr. Anderson, you pointed out ahead of time a couple of other concerns and questions you're hearing. Do you want to ask about the fetal tissue, or whichever one you want?
Well, there's a couple of big ones. One is around the cell lines in fetal tissue with regard to abortion, anti-abortion folks, pro-life folks. In fact, I got a long email today about it, and also radio comments about that. And the other one is about color or race. So why don't we go with the abortions? So religion and race, those things will always create tension. So let's go with the religion first. Was the vaccine developed because it was using aborted fetuses?
I know people are quite concerned about this. I totally understand that, and that deserves a really clear answer. There are fetal cell lines that have been in use in laboratories for 40 or 50 years that were derived from elective pregnancy terminations in Scandinavia back in the 60s and 70s. And then a cell line, which is basically cells that will grow in the laboratory indefinitely, was derived from those terminations and has been used in many laboratories, and particularly in making vaccines for a long time. Now, is it complicit for a Christian who's pro-life to take advantage of a vaccine that's had some of those fetal cell lines? Reasonable people will disagree on that. Let me be clear. There are no abortions involved in these vaccines. There are no fetal tissues involved in these vaccines. The sole connection is to these immortal cell lines that are growing in laboratories for the last 40 or 50 years from something that happened back then. I can also tell you,
a fetal cell line. Could you be so kind to help me? Like I'm a fourth grader here. What's a fetal cell line, and how is that different?
So in both of these instances, they were able to take cells, in one instance from the kidney, I can't remember what the other one was, of the aborted fetus, and put it into a Petri dish and gave it various kinds of nutrients to see whether those cells would still grow outside of the body. And they did, and they continue to. So it is an ongoing cell line derived from that single aborted fetus 40 or 50 years ago. That is very useful because it's kind of a little biochemistry factory if you want to try to figure out something about human cells, because it is a human cell. Now, the messenger RNA vaccines, that would be Pfizer and Moderna, do not utilize those cell lines for their manufacture. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has to be grown in such a cell line in order for it to be properly produced. And so it is grown in one of those lines, the one from about 1974. I notice that the Catholic Church has thought a lot about this, and that's obviously a very strongly pro-life perspective. And the Vatican has indicated that they believe it is entirely ethical for Catholics to take advantage of these vaccines, although they think it would be better if you took advantage of one that wasn't grown in a fetal cell line. If that all you have available to you is one that is totally acceptable. So again, I think the main concern I have is that this has been blurred out to the point where people think they're using actively recently obtained abortion material for these vaccines. Absolutely not. It's this long-term connection, and it only applies to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as far as the manufacturer.
So decades ago, we had aborted fetuses that already done. There are no new abortions or recent abortions that we're using for this. It's already happened way before us decades ago. And so now some of these cell lines that have been taken from those fetuses are sitting there and being used for science. So then my ethical concern is it okay for me to use something from someone decades ago. So in Scandinavia, that really is what my choice is, that I need to be thinking through, as opposed to thinking, wow, someone just aborted their baby 5 years ago, and now that's why we're able to get this vaccine so quickly.
Right. No, you've stated it very well. And again, of the 3 vaccines that are approved in the U.S., 2 of them do not involve growth in these fetal cell lines, Pfizer and Moderna. Only the Johnson & Johnson one does.
Got it. Thank you for being so clear on that. And Deb Harsma, would it be okay for me to jump right over to the race?
Yeah. Let's be sure and talk about that.
Well, religion and race, right? So then, that there are many people in the African American community who are having a hard time saying yes to vaccinations because of distrust of, quote unquote, the system. And it's not just this phantom system. There was reality back in the 30s with regard to the Tuskegee experiments and others. And so people still remember that. My mom was born in 1933 and she's still alive. And so people remember these things, and it's a part of our history and heritage. As an African American who's a pastor, I want to be able to be confident to let Black and brown people know that this is good for you. This doesn't have some kind of conspiratorial agenda behind it from the white man trying to kill Black folk. My relationship with you and Deb is important here to talk about this. And I know you have friends and loved ones and people in your life who are people of color. But can you help us out here by talking about those that were a part of the process of helping this vaccination come to life?
Yes. Pastor, thank you for raising the issue and stating it so clearly. Yes, what happened with Tuskegee was a terrible blight on the ethics of medical research. We should remember it because it was such an egregious disregard for the rights of individuals, in this case, Black men, who were prevented from receiving a treatment for a treatable disease so that they could be observed for years. That never should have happened. President Clinton apologized for that very publicly back in the late 1990s, but the memory remains, and it should remain. And I can understand why African Americans who have heard of that might wonder, when here comes something else that's coming out of medical research, how do we know this is good for us too? And I worried about that a lot as we began to set up the trials for these vaccines. And to be honest, I think the companies that were running those trials were anxious to enroll as many people as fast as they could, and weren't working as hard as they maybe needed to reach out to those who might have been a little less likely to sign up. I can't tell you how many morning, very intense conversations I led over the course of the summer and the fall with those companies, basically saying, if you don't enroll a diverse group as part of your trial basically will have failed. People have to look at the results of that trial and see themselves. Yeah. And initially there was a lot of resistance to that, but people got it after a while. Look at the Moderna trial. They started off with a smattering of Black and brown people. By the time they enrolled all 30,000 and really got with this as a priority, 37% of the people in that trial were people of color. And that means when you look at the data, you can see yourself, whatever your race or ethnicity, and you can see that it didn't just work for the whole group, it worked for your group too. That should be very reassuring. Again, very transparent. The data is all out there. So I get it why this is an issue. And I get it for another reason, Dr. Anderson, and that is people can look right now at our healthcare system in the United States, and they can see that it is full of racial inequities. And again, why should they then say vaccines are being handled fairly when the rest of healthcare doesn't seem to be? We have a lot of work to do there as well. And 2020 is going to be remembered for COVID-19. It's also going to be remembered for George Floyd. And it's going to be this moment where we all had to wake up to the fact, if we didn't already know it, that racism is alive and well, and the structures of our society are still there supporting it, including our healthcare system. And we need to do something much more vigorous about that and not assume that we're post-racial. All of that kind of comes together here in the context of COVID-19, which has hit Black and brown communities much harder than white communities, to the point of 2 or 3-fold increases in numbers of hospitalizations and deaths per capita. And that is shining a bright and very distressing light on health disparities that we have to address. So I'm pretty passionate about this. If there's any place that we should be pulling out all the stops to make vaccines available and to answer questions, it's the people of color who have had the hardest go of it with this and have the most to gain by getting immunized and getting past this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, amen to all that. I'm so glad to hear those numbers about the Moderna trial, about the number of people of color involved in it. It is so good to know that it was all of us who were in that trial. And people of color were involved in the research to develop the vaccine. I think we have a picture we can show of that. This is Dr. Kizimika Corbett at NIH. And Francis, can you tell us a little bit about her?
I would love to. She is such an inspiring role model and such a great scientist. So that picture is taken in the laboratory of the Vaccine Research Center. The guy on the left with the mask on is President Biden. The person in the middle, yeah, that's me with my mask on. And on the right is Kizimika Corbett, who is a PhD, grew up in North Carolina, and has been right on the forefront of the development of these vaccines, especially the Moderna vaccine. She and her colleague Barney Graham are now being mentioned as people who might receive some major prizes for their work. And it's wonderful to see that in this instance, the science being led by an African-American woman is just one more bit of evidence that we're all in this together. And this disease doesn't really pay much attention to the color of our skin, and the degree to which we can all work on knocking that virus back into the shadows, the better that will be.
That's wonderful. So let's see. We have a little time left here.
I'm curious if I could ask Dr. Anderson, just in terms of how things are going in your church now. You're obviously putting a lot of your own effort into making it possible for people to receive immunizations. Yet when I look at the polls, I see the two groups that are most resistant now are white evangelical Christians and Republican men. And the latter group certainly troubles me because it makes it sound as if politics has become a good reason to make a decision about health. And that doesn't make a lot of sense from my perspective. And yet white evangelicals, I think, again, are caught up in this perhaps suspicion of science because we've had a complicated history here in terms of whether science and faith could get along. Certainly Deb Harsma, as the president of BioLogos, it's a major thing that BioLogos is wrestling with, and I think we're making some real progress there. But there are still uncertainties about whether people of faith can accept science for what it says it's doing, or whether there's some atheistic agenda there, which is sometimes assumed to be the case. Maybe sometimes there is the case, but if science is about truth, that shouldn't be colored over by anything else. But how about in your church? How is it going in terms of, do you have a lot of resistance? Are people coming around? What's it like in the real world there?
Well, thanks. Because we have over 52 different nations that worship together, you're going to get different groups who have different thought processes. And because I'm on a white evangelical conservative station and daily radio during the afternoon drive in the nation's capital, a lot of people have differing opinions on this. So what we found is we have to cast the net broadly, but we also must focus to try to help people individually and as groups. And I believe that comprehension begins with conversation. And so the more conversations we can have like this, and the conversations we have daily on radio and with our congregants through emails and through videos, the more conversations that we can have with credible local voices, is what's going to help us at a micro level, because macro voices cast a broad net, but then it's back to those micro voices of Pastor, I'm breastfeeding. Right. And so for me to be able to say to her or to her husband, it's okay. Because if you say it from TV, they still might not know, is it really okay for me, even if it's okay for them? So this is why us partnering together is so very helpful, because as I deal with people every single day, I realize that there's a macro approach and there's a micro approach, and the kind of information that you and Deb Harsma and so many others from the faith community, the BioLogos community, the science community, the more you equip us, the more it helps me to be able to equip them. But that's just the informative piece. What you also need is the practical piece, and that's why doing vaccinations at the church now gives people an opportunity not just to keep it in theory in their conversations, but to put it into action. And when they see me do it, when they see other leaders do it, and when they see that we're promoting it, it actually really helps them say, like, I know one lady right now, she's listening, and she did not take advantage of the vaccines that we had available last Wednesday. I said, we have them again next Wednesday. She said, I don't know if I'm going to do it or not. I said, you make sure you're on this webinar with Deb Harsman and Dr. Collins. And because when she listens to this, she'll then say, you know what, Pastor, I'll be there Wednesday.
But you are so right that voices like yours are the most important ones right now to try to convey trust. You know, I know how I come across. I'm an old white guy who works for the government. Probably that's not the kind of compelling voice that a skeptic in the Black and brown community needs to hear. They need to hear from you. I need to hear from doctors, their community leaders who have done as you're saying, the way they have the facts and are willing to step up and convey those to people who are really looking for answers and need to hear them from somebody they know and they trust. And I'm just hoping we see a whole lot more of that in the next couple of months, because this is a critical couple of months, Pastor. We're not done with this coming out of the dark place yet. And if we can't manage to get close to this magic number of maybe it's 85% of our country being immunized, then this terrible pandemic could go on and on and on, and nobody wants that.
Well, and this is why our partnership is so important, because your voice, I know you say, oh, white guy, government, but we need that, right? Because that's going to hit, remember, it's white men who are evangelicals who are like, yeah, we're not going to get this based on maybe politics or whatever. And so we need each other to communicate to one another and to each other. But in that vein, can I ask you a question about the credibility of Dr. Anthony Fauci? Deb Harsma has said at times, you know, you're Dr. Fauci's boss. You know him very well. He's probably the most visible voice when it comes to this. It might be helpful for people to hear from me and to hear from you. Should we be listening to this guy?
Well, yes, I absolutely think we should all be listening. I will talk to him later tonight because I talk to him almost every evening. Yes, he does report to me, but he is probably the most highly respected expert in infectious diseases in the world. And he runs the part of NIH, which is focused on infectious disease and has done so for the last 37 years. So in terms of depth of knowledge and expertise, there's nobody I would trust more than him to provide straight answers to questions. He has been incredibly visible, and when you're that visible, there are going to be times where people don't like what you say, and there are going to be times where science tells you something that you didn't know before, and so you have to change your recommendation on the basis of new knowledge. And that shouldn't be a reason for people to say, oh, you're flip-flopping. No, you're actually providing up-to-date information because we've learned more about this virus. We didn't know a thing about this virus in January of 2020. We've been learning things at a prodigious rate. That means that some of the recommendations that were made in the first couple of months would no longer be correct. that's the way it ought to be. You wouldn't want to be stuck into something based upon imperfect information if you could do better. But he has been criticized, I think, by those who want to find something to complain about. He's not a political person. I know this really. He avoids at all costs getting pulled into arguments that are political instead of scientific. But there's certainly people who want to pull him into those arguments. So I would say, yes, you can trust Dr. Fauci. Whatever he's telling you, it is on the basis of the best information he's got at that time. It is not a self-serving moment. It's a public servant moment.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's good to hear.
It's good to know. Now, you were starting to talk, Francis, about the magic number we have to get to. We titled this session, How Christians Can Help End the Pandemic. So to get there, we need this community immunity thing. Can you tell us a little more about that? And especially for people who are saying, oh, well, I'm basically a healthy person. I don't need the vaccine. That's just for the people who have conditions and so forth. So help us understand that.
That's a really great question. We've known from other pandemics that the way in which something ultimately burns out is that 80 to 85% of the population end up immune. There are two ways to get there. One is they get the virus and recover from it, or else they don't. And the other is the vaccine. The vaccine is a better way. We've already lost 560,000 lives in the United States, and we don't want to lose any more. But in order to get to that magic moment where the virus has lost an awful lot of people that can infect, and so it basically loses the chance to continue transmission, we need to get up to that 80 to 85% coverage. We're on a path to get there, but only if people who are invited to receive the vaccine, most of them decide to say yes. Now think about this. This tells you that your decision about whether or not to be vaccinated is not just about yourself. It's also about whether you're going to be part of the overall solution for your community. In that regard, this is, as I've been saying in other places, this is a love your neighbor moment. Even if you think you are yourself not likely to be bothered by the virus if you happen to catch it, well, if you do, you're going to spread it to the next person. And if we haven't reached the moment where we have that 80 to 85% coverage, this is going to go on. And your actions could result in the death of another person. So I don't mean to overstate this too much. It's really the case. We do have a corporate communal responsibility to look out after each other. And part of that is to roll up your sleeve. Even if you don't think you need it, do it for your neighbor. Do it for your people down the street. Do it for people who are immune suppressed, who aren't going to be able to respond to the vaccine and who are there much more vulnerable and counting on the rest of us to get to this herd immunity so that they can be spared. That falls on all of our shoulders.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing how much the themes that we know so well as Christians come into this. Like, it is about loving your neighbor. It's about caring for your community. And so I got my shot last week and I had a little bit of side effects for a day. It wasn't too bad. But knowing that that's something that I can do that will help protect others, it's a really powerful thing to be able to do that. So yes, love your neighbor, get the shot.
Yes, absolutely. And those side effects that you mentioned, I had that as well after my second vaccine dose. I had chills and I was a little feverish for 24 hours. But I kind of liked the fact that said my immune system is really working. It's really noticed that it was asked to make some antibodies against that spike protein, and it's hard at work right now. And maybe that's not a side effect. Maybe that's just an effect, which says this vaccine is doing what it's supposed to. So yeah, people who have had some of those experiences for maybe a day after the first or the second dose, celebrate. That's your body is actually designed by God Almighty to be ready to take on a challenge, and you just got a challenge and you responded.
You mentioned side effects. Somebody wrote in and asked, is there anything else they can do besides take the vaccine? Like, does vitamin D or exercise or diet, does that have an effect on COVID-19 at all, or not really?
I wish there were some things like that that could help, and some work has been done to try to identify them. And so far, it comes up empty. We really don't see anything that's simple like that is going to change things very much. There's one more thing I want to bring up, which is another reason, I think, for people who are maybe a little skeptical or reluctant about the vaccine to think about it. And that is this more recent realization that people who get sick with COVID-19 don't all get better in the way that you would think in a couple of weeks. Most of the time with a respiratory virus, you might be sick for a couple of weeks, but then you get back to where you were. It looks like as many as a third of the people who have COVID-19, including people who were only mildly ill, don't seem to get better. Weeks later, they're still fatigued, they're short of breath, they have this brain fog, which is making it hard for them to function in daily activities. We don't understand that. NIH has just started a very major effort to try to figure this out. But there's one more reason. Even if you think your likelihood of an acute severe illness is low because you're a young person, young people also get this long COVID outcome after a mild illness and are struggling to recover from it. So we have a solution. It's called the vaccine. And it's one more reason why people who might otherwise think of themselves as young and immortal might want to take advantage of this as soon as they get the chance. And everybody's getting the chance now because we have enough doses. So please, people, consider this. Roll up your sleeve.
We promised to talk about variants of the vaccine. We haven't talked about that. Can you just briefly explain about those and how this impacts the conversation?
Yeah, this is one more reason for us to be worried about getting this over with, because the virus doesn't turn out to be just taking this challenge lying down. The virus is evolving. If you wanted a little snapshot of evolution in action, look what this virus has done over the course of the last 15 months, where it is capable, by making mistakes in copying its genome, to have a change that makes that virus just a little more infectious. And those are now taking over in some places. There's this terrible outbreak right now in Michigan with a variant called B117, which is about 70% more contagious than the original virus and also more potentially lethal. That's why I'm really worried about Michigan right now, because that's where the outbreak is the worst. Right now, the vaccines work against that variant and another one from South Africa, another one from Brazil. But we don't want to give this virus too many more opportunities to develop even more variants that ultimately might not respond to the vaccine. The only way you get more variants is for the virus to have people to copy itself in. So if we can cut back the infections, we can send those variants away, and we really need to do that.
Oh, so true. So many reasons for us to stay strong, to keep following the rules about masks and distancing, to get vaccinated. It protects ourselves, it protects our neighbors, it protects from new variants arising, it helps our community. And it's not that it's risk-free. Everything in medicine, there's some risk to it, but the risks of not vaccinating are so high.
So much.
Well, with just a couple minutes left, I wanted to end by asking you, each of you, where are you finding hope as we look ahead? Let's start with you, Dr. Collins, and we'll go to Dr. Anderson.
But it has been a tough 15 months, and I must say there are times where I felt quite distraught, and especially seeing the terrible toll this virus has taken of so many lives. I spent a lot of time in scriptures trying to seek out words of comfort, and I find myself in the Psalms a lot as a result of that. And if you think that somehow our era is the only one that's ever gone through suffering, well, you don't have to read very many pages of the Bible to see that that's not the case. But there's so many words of comfort there, whether it's Psalm 46, my favorite right now, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Or if I'm feeling fearful because things aren't going right, I go to 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. We're not given a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. We have all these promises from God, and that's where my hope comes from. And we are making progress. We are going to get through this. But if there was ever a time for all of us to decide to lock our arms together and do this together, this is it. If we want to see this, basically go into the rearview mirror and leave us alone. We can get there.
And Dr. Anderson, where are you finding hope?
Well, I think Christians can help in the pandemic because we're the ones that have Jesus in our boat. Remember how Jesus was going through the storm with the disciples and the storm was raging? Well, Mark tells us in his gospel that he's the only one out of the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He says in this verse 36 at the very end, he says, and there were other boats. So that means that the storm was raging, but they had Jesus in their boat. And so they went and called on Jesus. If Christians would pray and call on Jesus to bring an end to the pandemic, the other boats may not even know why the storm calmed, but we'll know that he stepped up to the boat and he said to the wind and the waves, be still. And guess what? They obeyed him. And so what happens is we can be like the disciples and be in line with the crisis and drama and Jesus, don't you even care? Oh my gosh, it's a storm. We can come in line with that, or we can be like the winds and the waves and come in line with Jesus's peace. And while he is in our boat, he's not in everybody else's boat. Everybody else is, but here's the good news. They're all on the same sea. And as long as Christians are in the world, we're the ones that go to Jesus. We're the ones that say, Lord, please end the pandemic. And so I leave you with 3 Ps: pray, practice, and promote. Pray to Jesus that he'll end the pandemic. Practice healthy habits like social distancing and wearing your mask out of love, and then promote the vaccines because we already know that that's a gift from God. There's your sermon from the preacher, okay?
Amen to that. All right. What a great way to summarize everything we've been talking about. Thank you, David.
That is wonderful. Thank you for a great ending note, Dr. Anderson. Thank you both for being with us today for a wonderful conversation. For everyone listening, please share this. The recording will be available as soon as this is over on the social media channels and later on the BioLogos website. You can share it right away. And we are the church. We have local communities of trust everywhere among some of the groups that are most concerned about the vaccine. So for everyone listening, work through your church, work through your friends and family, and let's help get the word out of really good information, what the science is saying, and good theology of the hope we can have in God and that we do not need to be afraid. So thank you all for a wonderful evening, and God bless.
God bless. Deb, thanks,
Good night.
Dr. Anderson.
And thank you,
Right.
Dr. Collins, and Deb as well. God bless.